Tonight, before we begin, picture a narrow street in a cold American city in the first week of January in the year 1776, an hour before the winter light comes up. The snow has been walked into grey ridges along the middle of the road, and the shutters are still closed on every window but one, and behind that one window there is a printing house with its fires already lit. Inside, a press is working. You can hear it from the street if you stand still, a slow wooden knock and sigh, the sound of a great screw being turned down onto damp paper and released again, over and over, the way a heart works when it is not in any hurry. And the sheets coming off that press, still faintly warm, still smelling of lampblack and linseed oil and wet rag paper, are being hung to dry in rows above the men's heads like small pale flags. There are 47 pages in the thing they are printing. It has no author's name on it anywhere. On the title page it says only that it was written by an Englishman, which is true, and it says almost nothing else, and it costs 2 shillings, and in 3 months' time 120,000 copies of it will have gone out into a country of only 2.5 million people, which is a number so out of proportion to that country that nothing quite like it has happened before or since. The man who wrote it is asleep somewhere else in the city, in a rented room, in a coat he has been wearing for 2 years. He is 38 years old. He has failed at every single thing he has ever attempted. He has been a corset maker and gone under, a shopkeeper and gone under, a schoolteacher for a few months, a sailor on a privateer for 1 voyage, and a tax collector twice, sacked twice, the second time for the crime of politely asking Parliament for a raise. He arrived in this city a little over a year ago so ill with ship fever that he had to be carried off the vessel on a stretcher. Unable to stand, unable to speak much, a charity case, with a letter of introduction in his baggage, and almost nothing else. And in those 47 pages he has just done the thing that no one in America has yet dared to do in print. He has not complained about a tax. He has not petitioned for the restoration of ancient liberties. He has gone straight past all of the ministers and all of the parliaments and all of the polite fiction that the trouble lies with the king's bad advisers. And he has walked directly up to the Crown itself and told the whole continent, in plain kitchen English that a farmer could read aloud to his family after supper, that the institution of hereditary monarchy is a fraud, that a king is nothing but a crowned ruffian at the head of a line of ruffians, and that a small island cannot forever govern a continent any more than a moon can govern a sun. In the country he was born in, those sentences are a hanging matter, not a fine, not a scolding in the newspapers. The formal charge is seditious libel, and the older charge underneath it, if the government wants to reach for it, is treason, and the punishment for treason on paper in the 18th century is not a gentle one. He knows this perfectly well. He is an Englishman. He grew up in a market town in Norfolk with a gallows on the hill above it, where the assize judges came twice a year, and the hangings were a kind of public event that the whole town walked out to watch. He has known since he was a boy exactly what the state does to people who make themselves inconvenient to it. And he has put it all down anyway, and let it go out anonymously into the snow. And in the morning the sheets will be folded and stitched and stacked, and carried out to the taverns and the coffee houses, and the ferry landings, and the ships, and nothing in the English-speaking world will be arranged quite the same way again. That is where we are going tonight. We are going to follow one man's whole life, from a staymaker's cottage in an English market town to a rented room in New York 72 years later, and the thread we are going to follow all the way through is a very simple one. Every single time this man had a choice between a quiet life and a fight with a power far larger than himself, he chose the fight. He chose it against the British Crown. He chose it against Parliament. He chose it against the men who ran the revolution he had helped to start. He chose it against the most feared man in France, from inside a French prison, with the executioner's cart going past the window every morning. He chose it so consistently and so unprofitably that he died with almost nothing, in a borrowed room, with 6 people at his funeral. But not yet. For now, let the press knock and sigh. Let the warm sheets hang and dry, and let us get comfortable, because we have a long, quiet way to travel together, and there is no hurry at all about any of it. So settle in now, wherever you are. Let the day you have just finished begin to loosen its hold on you. It is over. Whatever was in it, whatever went well and whatever did not, it is finished now, and it cannot be improved by your thinking about it in the dark. Let your shoulders come down. They have been up somewhere near your ears for hours, holding a weight that is not even yours to hold, and they can come down now. Let your jaw unclench, just slightly, just enough. Let the pillow take the entire weight of your head, all of it. Because that is precisely what a pillow is for. And there is nothing left tonight that you have to hold up. Your breathing does not need to be managed. It has been doing this without your supervision since the first minutes of your life, and it will keep doing it while you sleep. My only work from here on is to talk quietly and steadily and without any sudden turns, and to tell you about a man who lived a very long time ago, and to keep the story warm and slow enough that at some point you simply stop following it and drift off, and that is not a failure of listening. That is the entire point. If you wake at 3 a.m, and I am still going, you have not missed anything. You can pick up wherever you are, or you can let it go by. It will still be here. Now let us begin properly, and to begin properly we have to go back 40 years before that printing house, and across an ocean to a small flat place in the east of England where nothing much ever happened. The town is Thetford in Norfolk. It sits in a shallow valley where 2 small rivers meet, in a landscape of chalk and flint and sandy heath, a country of wide low fields and long horizons and enormous slow skies, where the wind comes in off the North Sea with nothing much in the way to stop it. It is an ancient place. It had been a great town once, centuries earlier, a place of monasteries and bishops. And then the monasteries went, and the bishops went, and the town settled down into being what it was in 1737, which was a modest market centre of about 2,000 people, with a corn mill and a brewery and a coaching inn and a few streets of low houses with roofs of thatch and pantile. On the 29th of January in that year, in a small house on Bridge Street, in a room that would have been heated by a single fire and lit by rushlight, a boy was born to a staymaker and his wife, and he was baptized into a household that was, from the very first day, quietly divided against itself. His father was a Quaker. That mattered a great deal more in the 1730s than it is easy to imagine now. To be a Quaker in an English market town in that period was to be respectable, hard-working, sober, trusted in business, and simultaneously a second-class subject in your own country. Quakers would not take oaths, which locked them out of most public office and out of the universities entirely. They would not remove their hats to social superiors, which made them faintly ridiculous and faintly insolent in the eyes of everyone above them. They would not pay the church rates that supported the established church, and so their goods were periodically distrained, meaning a constable came to the house and took away furniture or tools to the value of the unpaid rate. They sat in plain meeting houses in silence, waiting for whoever felt moved to speak, with no priest at the front and no altar and no music, and they addressed everyone alike as thee and thou, servant and squire, which was not a quirk of speech but an argument. It was a whole political philosophy carried inside a pronoun. The boy grew up inside that. He grew up watching his father be a good and honest tradesman who was also, in the eyes of the law, a dissenter to be tolerated rather than a citizen to be counted. And his mother was the other half of the division. She was an Anglican, the daughter of a local attorney, 11 years older than her husband, and by every surviving account not an easy woman to live with. She was of the established church, the church of the state, the church whose bishops sat in the House of Lords. So the boy was taken to the parish church and baptized, and later confirmed in the faith of his mother, while being raised in the plain speech and plain habits and plain conscience of his father, and the two halves never fused. What he took from the Quaker side stayed with him for the whole of his life, and can be seen on every page he ever wrote. He took the flat refusal to believe that any human being is born the superior of any other. He took the plain style, the suspicion of ornament, the sense that if a thing is true it can be said simply, and if it can only be said grandly it is probably not true. He took a conscience that did not care in the slightest about consequences. And what he took from the other side was rather less peaceful. He never became a Quaker himself, and in time he would break with them entirely over the question of war, because he came to believe that there were fights worth having, which the Friends did not, and later he would break with organised religion altogether in a way that cost him nearly everything. But that is a long way ahead of us tonight. Now, the trade. His father made stays. A stay is the 18th century corset, and stay-making was a real craft, closer to bespoke tailoring than to anything cheap. It meant cutting heavy linen and canvas, sewing narrow channels into it by hand, and threading each channel with a length of whalebone, which is not bone at all but baleen, the flexible keratin plates from a whale's mouth, imported through the whaling ports and split and shaved down with a knife until it would bend without cracking. The finished garment was engineered. It had to hold a body in a particular fashionable shape for hours without cutting into it, and it had to be measured and fitted to one particular person, and the maker had to understand exactly how much force a curved piece of baleen would deliver against a seam. It was, in a small way, structural work. It required patience and hand strength, and an eye for how a load travels through a shape. And it is genuinely worth noticing, this early, because 30 years later this same man will design an iron bridge with a single arch of 100 feet and no piers in the water, on the principle that a slender curved member can carry an astonishing load if the geometry is right, and the men of the Royal Society will look at his drawings and take him seriously. He learnt that in a cottage workshop in Norfolk, with a knife and a length of whalebone in his hands. He also got some schooling, which was not universal for a tradesman's son. He went to Thetford Grammar School from the age of about 6 or 7 until he was 13. He did not learn Latin there, because his father would not permit it, on the Quaker grounds that the classical authors were pagan and their books were full of vanity and slaughter, and so the boy sat out the Latin lessons. He always claimed afterwards that this was one of the luckiest things that ever happened to him, because it meant that when he finally began to write, he had no classical models at all in his head. He could not decorate a sentence with a Latin tag even if he had wanted to. He had only English, and only the plainest English at that, the English of the Bible and the newspaper and the workshop, and so when he wanted to explain the constitution of a nation he reached instinctively for the images of a farm, a family, a ship, a house, a fire, a debt. That is exactly why a labouring man in Pennsylvania could follow him without stumbling once, when the same argument in a gentleman's pamphlet would have lost that reader in the first paragraph. What he did love at school was mathematics, and what they then called natural philosophy, which is science, and one master there had sailed as a boy and told him about the wider world and the sea, and that took hold of him badly, and above the town, on the road out, there was the gallows. Thetford was an assize town. Twice a year the circuit judges came down from London in their coaches, with their wigs and their trumpeters and their escort, and the town filled up, and the court sat, and the cases were heard, and then the sentences were carried out on a low rise of ground outside the town that everybody called Gallows Hill. The list of crimes that carried death in England in those years is one of the strangest documents of the century. It grew and grew until there were well over 100 capital offences on the books, and later still more than 200. Stealing goods worth more than a shilling from a shop. Taking a sheep. Taking a horse. Cutting down a young tree in an orchard, being found in a wood at night with a blackened face. Returning from transportation before your term was out. Forging a document. Sending a threatening letter. The scale of the thing was completely detached from the scale of the harm, and everybody knew it, and it was defended on the ground that property must be protected, and that the terror of the example was what kept the poor in order. And the people hanged at Thetford were, almost without exception, poor. They were labourers and servants and boys. A child could grow up in that town and watch, twice a year, the entire apparatus of the state arrive in a coach, sit in a panelled room, and then take the life of someone from a cottage very much like his own, over the value of a coat or a lamb, and see the whole thing conducted with immense dignity and correct procedure and prayers, and then see the coaches go away again. That is the political education of a boy in an English market town in the 1740s, and no one had to explain it to him. He simply saw it, at an age when a person does not yet have any theory to file such a thing under, and it sat in him. Everything he wrote about power later on has that hill somewhere underneath it. He never wrote about kings as an abstraction. He wrote about them the way a man writes about a landlord who has taken his tools. At 13 he came out of school and went into the workshop as his father's apprentice, and for 3 years he cut canvas and shaved whalebone and stitched channels, and he hated it, or at least he could not stay inside it. It was a life you could see the whole of from the beginning. You would make stays in Thetford and marry a girl from Thetford and take over the shop and make stays in Thetford until you died, and the horizon of the entire arrangement was about 4 streets wide. He was 16 when he ran. This is the first of the many times in his life when he simply walks out of the situation he is in, with no plan and no money, in a direction that any sensible person would call ruinous. He went down to the coast to go to sea, and not to the merchant service either. There was a war beginning, the great worldwide war that would run for 7 years, and the ports were full of privateers, which were privately owned armed ships licensed by the government to attack and capture enemy merchant vessels and keep a share of the proceeds. It was legalized piracy with paperwork, and it drew in exactly the sort of desperate young men you would expect, and the casualty rates were appalling. He got as far as signing aboard one of them, a ship whose captain's name was, of all the names in the world, Death, and which was called the Terrible, and his father came after him and found him on the deck and talked him off the ship and took him home. That intervention almost certainly saved his life. The Terrible sailed, met a French privateer, and was cut to pieces in a battle in which most of her crew, including her captain, were killed. Somewhere between 100 and 200 men died on a vessel he had been standing on. A year later, undeterred, and this time without being caught, he went to sea after all on another privateer, and served a voyage, and came back with prize money in his pocket, and that was the end of his career at sea. He was in his early 20s then, and what follows is nearly 20 years of quiet, grinding, unremarkable failure, which is the part of his life that almost no one knows, and which is the part that matters most, because it is where the anger came from. He worked as a journeyman staymaker in London and then in Dover. He went to lectures in London on natural philosophy, on Newtonian astronomy and electricity and mechanics, paying his shillings at the door to sit at the back of a room and listen to men demonstrate the movements of the planets with brass orreries and draw sparks from glass globes. And he read whatever he could get, and this self-education, unsystematic and taken in the evenings after work, is the whole of his higher education. Then he set up on his own account in Sandwich in Kent, a decayed-old port that had silted up so badly that the sea had left it stranded a mile inland. Which tells you something about the commercial judgment of a young man choosing where to start a business. He was 22. He took a shop, hung out his sign, and married a young woman named Mary. Within a year the business had failed. They moved to Margate to escape the creditors, and there, before their first anniversary, his wife died, and the child died with her, in childbirth. He was 23 years old, a bankrupt, a widower, and childless, and he never in his whole life afterwards spoke or wrote about it in any surviving document. It is a silence you can hear. He went home to Thetford, and there he made the decision that would shape the next 12 years, which was to try for a place in the excise service. The excise was the department that collected the internal duties, the taxes on beer and spirits and tobacco and salt and soap and candles and leather and paper and glass. which is to say the taxes on almost everything ordinary people bought. It was the great revenue engine of the 18th century British state, and it was, by the standards of that state, remarkably well organised. It had examinations. It had a manual. It had standardised gauging instruments and standardised arithmetic for calculating the contents of an irregular vessel. It had a supervisory hierarchy and surprise inspections of its own officers. It was, in fact, one of the first genuinely modern bureaucracies in Europe, and to get into it you had to be numerate and literate and able to keep a book. He studied, he passed, and at 24 he became a supernumerary officer of the excise, and was posted and rode a horse from village to village in the rain with a set of dipping rods and a book of tables, gauging casks of beer in the cellars of inns, and measuring stock in tanneries and chandlers' sheds, and calculating duty and writing it all down. And he lasted 3 years before he was dismissed in disgrace. The offence was called stamping. It meant signing off on goods you had not actually inspected, entering the stock from the trader's own word, rather than gauging it yourself, which was universal in the service because the rounds were too long to ride honestly in the hours available, and which was punished savagely on the rare occasions it was noticed. He wrote a letter admitting it, and he was struck off, and for a year he was nothing at all. He worked as a journeyman staymaker again, which for a man who had held a government post was a humiliating step backwards. And he taught for a while in a school in London for a wage of about £25 a year, and he petitioned over and over in the correct form to be restored to the excise. And eventually he was. That is worth pausing on for a second, because it shows you something about him that the later legend tends to smooth away. This is not a man who despises institutions on principle. He wanted the place back. He wrote the letters. He waited. He was restored in 1768 and posted to the town of Lewes in Sussex, and it is in Lewes that the man we are actually here to talk about finally begins to appear. Lewes is a hill town on the River Ouse, a few miles up from the sea, built on a steep chalk ridge with a Norman castle at the top of it, and narrow lanes running down. It was a town with a long memory and a stubborn streak. In the 16th century, 17 Protestant martyrs had been burned in front of the town hall there, and the town had never quite forgotten it, and it was the sort of place that took its local liberties seriously, argued in public, and did not like being told. He lodged at a house on the high street belonging to a tobacconist and grocer named Samuel Olive above the shop, and he took up his rounds, and he joined the town's civic life with real enthusiasm. He was elected to the vestry, the parish body that levied the rates for the relief of the poor, and he served on it and argued in it. He played bowls, and in the evenings he went to the White Hart Inn, where a group of the town's tradesmen and professional men met in a room upstairs as a debating club they called the Headstrong Club, and he became its great ornament. The rule of the club was that a question was proposed, and both sides were argued, and the man judged to have argued best was awarded a title of honour that consisted of a decorated snuff-box, and by every account he won it so often that it became a joke. This is a man in his early 30s, in a room over a pub, in a small English town, arguing every week for years, in front of an audience of butchers and attorneys and shopkeepers who will not be impressed by anything except a good clear point clearly made. It is the best possible training for what he is about to do, and it is where he learns the thing that no university would have taught him, which is how to win a room of ordinary men with an argument. 2 years after he arrived, his landlord died. He carried on the tobacco and grocery business with the widow, and in 1771 he married the daughter of the house, Elizabeth, who was 10 years younger than he was. The marriage was, by every indication, a disaster from the beginning. It lasted 3 years and produced no children, and when it ended by a formal deed of separation with a settlement of money, and again. As with his first wife, he never afterwards said one word about it in public. Enemies would make a great deal of that silence later. Meanwhile, the shop was failing, as everything he touched commercially always failed, and the excise salary was not covering the difference. And in the winter of 1772, at the age of 35, in the last year before everything came apart, He did the thing that turned him from a provincial excise officer into a writer. The excise officers of England had a grievance, and it was a real one. Their pay had been fixed at £50 a year, and out of that they had to keep a horse, and pay for its stabling and feed, and pay for their own lodging on the road, and buy their own instruments and books. And the real value of that £50 had been eaten away steadily by the rising cost of everything for decades, so that a man in the service was, in practice, poorer every year he served. The consequence was exactly what you would expect. Officers took bribes from the traders they were supposed to be gauging, because a man who cannot feed his horse honestly will find another way to feed it, and the revenue of the state suffered accordingly. The officers up and down the country agreed to raise a subscription among themselves, a few shillings each, to fund a petition to Parliament, and they needed someone to write the case. And they chose him. What he produced was a piece of about 4,000 words called The Case of the Officers of Excise, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment, because everything he would later do to the Crown of England is already visible in it in miniature, done politely, in a professional register, about a pay claim. He did not write it as a beggar. He did not appeal to the mercy or the generosity of the great. He built an argument in 3 moves. First, the facts of the case, laid out in figures a clerk could check, showing exactly what £50 a year had to cover and what remained after the horse. Second, the consequence to the state, not to the officers, arguing that underpaying the men who collect the revenue is not a saving but a hidden and enormous cost, because poverty in a revenue officer converts directly into corruption, and corruption converts directly into lost duty. And third, the moral point, made quietly and only once, that poverty is not a school of virtue, and that it is unreasonable for a government to demand incorruptibility from men it has deliberately kept poor. That third move is the whole of him. It is the assumption, stated as though it were obvious, that a person's character is substantially made by their circumstances, and therefore that a government which arranges the circumstances is responsible for the character it produces. It is a completely different way of thinking about the poor from the one that prevailed in his century, in which poverty was very largely understood as a moral verdict. He had 4,000 copies printed at his own risk and the officer's subscription, and then he took unpaid leave through the winter of 1772 into 1773 and went to London to lobby with them. Picture that winter. A 35-year-old provincial officer in a plain coat, in the greatest city in Europe, going day after day to the lobby of the House of Commons and to the offices of the Board of Excise and to the coffee houses where members might be found, handing his pamphlet to men who took it out of politeness and did not read it, waiting on benches in cold corridors, learning in the most direct possible way what it feels like to be on the outside of a closed system of patronage, holding a perfectly good argument that no one has any interest in hearing. He kept it up for months. Nothing whatever came of it. Parliament did not debate the case. The pay was not raised. And it is not a coincidence that when this man finally sat down to write about the British Constitution, 3 years later and 3,000 miles away, he wrote about it not as a philosopher who had studied it, but as a petitioner who had stood in its corridors in the winter and been ignored. He knew the smell of the place. What came of it instead was the ruin of everything he had. Somebody in the service noticed that an officer had been absent from his post for months, agitating. In the spring of 1774, he was dismissed from the excise for the second time, and this time there would be no restoration. 2 weeks later, his shop and his household goods were advertised for sale at public auction to satisfy his creditors, which was the only way to avoid a debtor's prison, and everything he owned was carried out of the house on the high street and sold in the street to his neighbours. And within weeks of that, the deed of separation between him and his wife was signed, and he handed over the settlement, and he walked out of Lewes with, as far as anyone can establish, about £30 and a change of clothes. He was 37. He had no trade he wished to return to, no wife, no children, no employer, no capital, no patron, no degree, no connections, and a public record of dismissal from government service. In the ordinary run of the 18th century, a man in that position disappears. He becomes a clerk somewhere, or he drinks, or he goes into the army, or he is simply never heard of again, and the historical record swallows him as it swallowed millions. And instead, in London that summer, through the excise business, and through his interest in natural philosophy, he was introduced to an American. The American was 68 years old, and he was the most famous private individual in the English-speaking world. He had begun as a printer's apprentice in Boston, run away, made himself rich in Philadelphia, retired from business at 42, and then made himself immortal by flying a kite in a thunderstorm and demonstrating that lightning is electricity, for which the Royal Society had given him its highest medal and half the courts of Europe had received him. He had lived in London for most of the last 17 years as the agent for several of the American colonies, which is to say as their lobbyist, arguing their case to a government that had steadily stopped listening. And in January of that same year, 1774, he had been called before the Privy Council in a room called the Cockpit, and, in front of a packed and delighted audience of courtiers, had been abused for an hour by the Solicitor General as a thief and a man without honour, standing perfectly still in a suit of Manchester velvet, without saying a word, and had walked out of that room a different man than he walked in. He was, at the moment of this meeting, an old and celebrated and quietly furious man who had just discovered that 30 years of patient loyal argument had brought him nothing but a public humiliation. So the two of them met, and something in the younger man impressed the older one enough that he wrote him a letter of introduction to his son-in-law in Philadelphia, describing the bearer as an ingenious, worthy young man, and suggesting he might find work as a clerk, or an assistant tutor, or a surveyor. That letter is the hinge of the whole story. It is a modest letter. It promises very little. And with it in his baggage he sold what he had left, took passage on a ship called the London Packet, and in the autumn of 1774 he sailed for America. The crossing very nearly killed him. Ship fever broke out below decks, which is typhus, carried by lice, and in the close quarters of an 18th century emigrant passage, it went through the passengers like a fire in dry grass. 5 people died on that voyage. He was among the worst affected, and by the time the ship worked its way up the Delaware and came into Philadelphia at the end of November, he could not stand, could not walk, and had to be lifted out of the vessel and carried ashore on a stretcher and put into a bed, where he lay for 6 weeks, weak as a child, in a strange city, with no money, and 1 letter. The letter did its work. A physician came, sent by the man to whom the letter was addressed, because the name at the bottom of it opened doors in that city that opened for no other name, and he was nursed until he could sit up, and then until he could walk, and by the middle of January of 1775 he was on his feet in Philadelphia and looking for employment. Now, let us look at where he had landed, because it matters enormously that it was here and not anywhere else. Philadelphia in 1775 was about 40 years old as a serious city, and it was already the largest in British America, with something like 30,000 people, which made it the second largest city in the entire British Empire after London itself. It had been laid out on a grid by its Quaker founder, which no old European city was, so it had wide straight streets running down to the river and numbered cross streets, and it was orderly and busy and astonishingly various. It had Quakers and Anglicans and German Lutherans and Moravians and Presbyterians and Catholics and a synagogue, and it had a hospital, and a lending library that any subscriber could use, and a philosophical society, and a college and street lamps and a fire company, and paved footways, most of which had been organised by the same elderly gentleman who had written the letter. The waterfront ran for 2 miles with ships from Bristol and Lisbon and Jamaica and Hamburg. There were print shops and bookbinders and papermakers, and there were coffee houses where the merchants read the London papers as soon as they came off the boats, only 2 months out of date. And the whole city was, in that winter, in a state of extreme political excitement, because the First Continental Congress had met there only weeks before he arrived, in a carpenter's hall a few streets from where he lay ill, and had agreed to a boycott of British goods, and the colonies were now suspended in a strange waiting silence to see what the government in London would do about it. It is very hard to think of a place in the world at that moment better arranged to receive a penniless self-taught English radical with a gift for plain prose. He found work almost at once, and the work was the making of him. A Scottish bookseller and printer named Robert Aitken was starting a monthly journal, the Pennsylvania Magazine, and needed someone to run it, and he took the job as editor at £50 a year, which was, with a certain irony, exactly the excise salary he had spent that London winter arguing was too small. But this time he was not gauging casks. He was writing. And he wrote enormously under a scatter of pen names, filling out the magazine month after month with whatever was needed, and what he chose to write about in that first year tells you exactly what kind of mind had just arrived in America. He wrote about the design of machinery. He wrote a piece on dueling. Against it, he wrote about the treatment of the elderly. He wrote a fierce short essay attacking African slavery and the trade that supplied it, at a time when many of the men who would shortly be writing about liberty in that city owned human beings outright and saw no contradiction, and it appeared within a few weeks of his taking up the editorship. He wrote in favour of the rights of women and against cruelty to living creatures and against the wanton killing of them for sport. He wrote about the injustice of the marriage laws. He wrote a satire on the honours and titles of Europe. Not one of those positions was fashionable. Several of them would not become respectable opinions in the English-speaking world for another century or more. And he was setting them in type in a shop in Philadelphia in 1775 for a magazine whose circulation rose from 600 to 1,500 in the space of a few months, which made it the most successful periodical in America. He was 38 in his first real job as a writer, and he had found the thing he could do. And then, on the 19th of April, on a village green in Massachusetts, a British officer ordered a body of colonial militia to disperse, and someone fired a shot that nobody has ever been able to attribute, and by the end of that day the regulars were retreating down the road from Concord to Boston under fire from behind every wall and tree along 17 miles of Massachusetts countryside, and 273 of them were dead or wounded, and the news went south along the post roads at the speed of a galloping horse. Which brings us back to the printing house in the snow, and to the 10th of January, 1776, and to the thing itself. On that Wednesday morning, in the shop of a Scottish bookseller on 3rd Street, a stitched pamphlet of 47 pages went on sale for 2 shillings. The title on the front was a single ordinary phrase, 2 words long, the sort of thing a man says at the end of an argument in a tavern, when he has run out of patience. Common sense. Underneath, in place of an author, it said only that it was written by an Englishman, and what happened next has no real parallel in the history of publishing. The first printing sold out in a matter of days. A second edition was on the press within 2 weeks and sold out. Then the pirates got hold of it, because there was no copyright worth the name across colonial borders, and it was reprinted in Philadelphia and New York and Boston and Salem and Hartford and Providence and Newport and Albany and Lancaster and Norwich and Charleston, edition after edition, some of them authorized, and most of them not. It was translated into German for the Pennsylvania farmers within weeks. Within 3 months, something on the order of 120,000 copies were in circulation. Within the year, the figure was very probably past 200,000, and by some counts approaching 500,000 once every pirated printing is added in. Now hold that against the population. There were about 2.5 million people in the 13 colonies, and perhaps a fifth of them were enslaved and forbidden by law, in most places to be taught to read, and of the rest a great many were children. The literate adult population that could actually buy and read a pamphlet was perhaps 500,000 people. 120,000 copies into that population in 3 months is a saturation that no book, no newspaper, no broadcast, nothing in the modern world has ever come close to matching. And a copy did not mean a reader. A copy meant a tavern where one man with a good voice read it aloud to a room of 20 over 3 evenings. It meant a farmhouse where it was read after supper by candlelight to a family and 2 hired hands. It meant a company of militia sitting on their packs while a sergeant read it out. It meant a ferry, a mill, a barber's shop, a ship's forecastle. The best estimate anyone can make is that within half a year, virtually every politically conscious adult in America had either read this pamphlet or heard the whole of it read out loud. Its author was a man who 14 months earlier had been carried off a ship on a stretcher, unable to stand, with £30 to his name and no reputation of any kind. And here is the part that people forget. He took nothing. The pamphlet was earning enough to have made him comfortable for life, and he assigned every penny of his share of the profits to the Continental Congress, to be spent on buying mittens for the army in Canada. He then got into a long, unpleasant public dispute with his first printer, not about his own money, but about the price. Because he wanted the thing sold as cheaply as possible so that more copies could go further, and he arranged a rival cut-price edition with other printers to force it down. He would do this for the rest of his life. Every major work he ever wrote he either gave away or priced at a loss on purpose, and he died poor as a direct and entirely predictable result of decisions he made deliberately, one after another, with his eyes open. So how did it get written, and why did it work when 100 other pamphlets in that same year did not? Go back a few months, to the summer and autumn of 1775. The fighting had started in April. There had been a great slaughter of British regulars on a hill outside Boston in June, where the Redcoats took the ground and lost more than 1,000 men doing it. Congress had appointed a Virginian planter to command an army that barely existed. And yet, in all that time, in all the thousands of columns of newspaper print, and all the resolutions and all the petitions, almost nobody in America was publicly saying the obvious thing. The official position, held by nearly every respectable man in the colonies, was that they were loyal subjects of the king, that their quarrel was with a corrupt ministry and a parliament in which they had no representation, and that what they wanted was the restoration of their rights as Englishmen inside the empire. Congress had sent the king a petition that very summer, written in the humblest possible language, begging him to intervene against his own ministers. Independence was not a proposal being debated and rejected. It was very largely unspeakable. It was to most colonists both morally shocking, because the reverence for monarchy went extremely deep, and practically insane, because it meant a permanent war against the greatest naval power on earth, without allies, without a navy, without a treasury, and without any government worth the name. A Philadelphia physician of radical views, a man who had studied medicine in Edinburgh and who would later sign the Declaration, had been urging that somebody ought to write the case for separation plainly, and had been unable to find anyone willing to put their name to such a thing. Because to argue publicly for independence in 1775 was to place yourself outside respectable society and inside the legal definition of treason. He suggested it to the English editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, a man with no property to lose, no family in America, no political career to protect, and no social position to forfeit, and the Englishman said yes. He wrote it through the autumn and early winter, and the physician read the sheets as they came and suggested the title, which was better than the one the author had wanted, which had been Plain Truth. And in the middle of that writing, in October, the king himself removed the last difficulty by declaring the colonies to be in open and avowed rebellion, and in the following months the news arrived that the British government had hired German soldiers, thousands of them, to be shipped across the Atlantic to fight, and that a royal fleet had burned the town of Falmouth in Maine to the ground in October, with no shelter provided for the inhabitants in the beginning of a New England winter. Every one of those facts went into the pamphlet while the ink was still wet. Now, what was actually in it? It has 4 parts and a long appendix, and the structure is a demolition carried out in a very particular order. He begins where nobody expected him to begin, which is not with taxes at all, but with the nature of government itself. Society, he says, is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. Society is a blessing, government at its very best is a necessary evil, and its whole legitimate purpose is security. That is the entire foundation, laid in about 200 words, in language a carpenter can follow, and it is devastating. Because if the only purpose of government is the security and freedom of the governed, then every institution has to justify itself by that test alone, and none of them can appeal to age, or dignity, or sacredness, or tradition. Then he turns to the English Constitution, which every educated man in the Atlantic world had been taught to regard as the most perfect political machine ever devised, admired by philosophers across Europe, the famous balance of king, lords and commons each checking the others. He takes it apart in a few pages. He says the balance is a fiction, because the Crown holds the power of appointment and can therefore purchase the commons at leisure, and a constitution in which one branch can bribe the others is not balanced at all. It is merely complicated enough that the fraud is hard to see. He says that the celebrated complexity is not a virtue, but a fog, and that a nation may suffer for years under a system it cannot even locate the fault in, because the parts are so arranged that when something goes wrong, nobody can be identified as responsible. And then he goes for the throne itself, and this is the passage that made the pamphlet a hanging matter. He argues that monarchy has no basis in nature, because nature does not divide mankind into kings and subjects any more than she divides them into males and females of different species, and that the distinction between king and subject is an artificial invention of men. He goes to the scriptures, which is a shrewd move in a country full of dissenting Protestants, who knew their Bible far better than they knew their Locke, and he shows that the ancient Israelites were governed without a king for centuries, that when they demanded one, the demand was treated as a rejection of God himself, and that the prophet's warning about what a king would do to them. Take their sons and their daughters and their fields and their harvests is in the text for anyone to read. Then hereditary succession, which he treats with open contempt, pointing out that the merit of a first ruler, even if real, gives no more guarantee about his grandson than about any other man's, that the whole system is a lottery in which the prize is a nation, and that England had been afflicted by kings who were children, and kings who were mad, and kings who were both stupid and cruel, and had no remedy for any of them. He traces the origin of the English royal line to a French bastard who arrived with an armed band and made himself king against the consent of the natives, which he calls a very paltry, rascally original, and which everybody knew perfectly well was accurate. And then the sentence that people copied into their letters for years afterwards, describing the whole institution as a plain matter of a crowned ruffian at the head of a gang, living off the labour of others while pretending to protect them. That is what it meant to be reading this in a tavern in 1776. It was not an argument about policy, it was the removal of the flaw. The king was the emotional centre of the entire imperial arrangement, the figure toasted at dinners, prayed for in every church every Sunday by law, the person to whom all those humble petitions were addressed. And here was an anonymous Englishman, in cheap print for 2 shillings, in a voice with no wig on it, saying calmly that the whole thing was an old confidence trick, and that any group of free men could do better by simply agreeing among themselves how they wished to be governed and writing it down. Then, having cleared the ground, he did the thing that made the difference between a scandal and a revolution, which was to become extremely practical. He does not end in outrage. He ends in arithmetic. The third section is a hard-headed assessment of American capabilities, and he goes through it like a man costing a job. He argues that America is not too weak but too strong to remain a colony, that a continent cannot forever be governed by an island, and that the moment is now, precisely because the country is young and its debts are small. He counts the shipyards. He counts the timber, the oak and the pine, the tar and the pitch and the hemp and the iron, and he observes that America is the only country in the world that possesses every material of a navy inside her own borders and does not have to buy one plank of it from abroad. And he estimates in pounds sterling what a fleet would cost to build, and he compares that with the trade it would protect. He notes that the British Navy, however enormous on paper, cannot possibly bring more than a fraction of itself to any one place at any one time, and that the rest is scattered from the Mediterranean to the Indies. He points out that no foreign power on earth can assist a rebellion by British subjects seeking reconciliation, because that would be interference in a domestic quarrel. but that any of them may treat with and assist an independent nation, and therefore that the Declaration of Independence is not the end of the road, but the necessary first step to getting French money, French powder, and a French fleet. That last argument is the one that persuaded the practical men in Congress, and it was correct. And it would be proved correct within 2 years at a place called Saratoga. And then, having done all that in plain prose, he lifted the whole thing at the end, in a passage that people who could not remember any of the arguments could still quote decades later, in which he says that the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind, that freedom has been hunted round the globe and driven out of Asia and Africa and Europe, and that England has warned her to depart, and that we have it in our power to begin the world over again, and that the birthday of a new world is at hand. And the effect on the country was almost physical. There is a period of about 10 weeks in the early spring of 1776 in which you can watch a whole continent change its mind in the surviving letters and diaries and newspapers. And the change is so sudden that if it were not documented from 100 directions at once, you would not believe it. Town meetings that had voted in November to instruct their delegates to seek reconciliation voted in April to instruct them to seek separation. The Virginian general commanding the army outside Boston, a cautious and extremely conventional man who had begun the war still drinking the king's health at dinner, wrote in the spring that sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning contained in that pamphlet would leave people at no loss to decide, and he ordered it read to his troops. Colonial assemblies rescinded their instructions one after another through May and June. A pamphlet does not by itself make a revolution, and the burnt town in Maine and the German mercenaries and the King's proclamation did an enormous amount of the work. But every single person involved at the time said that the pamphlet was what allowed the thought to be spoken out loud, and that once it could be spoken out loud, it turned out that most of them had been thinking it. On the 4th of July that year, less than 6 months after the printing house in the snow, a committee of Congress produced a document declaring the United Colonies to be free and independent states, and the man who drafted it, the Virginian, had read the pamphlet, and the second paragraph of that declaration proceeds along precisely the line the pamphlet had cleared, from the nature of rights to the purpose of government to the right of a people to alter it. The reply from the other side came fast, and it is worth noting how it came. In America, the Loyalists answered in print, and one of them, a Maryland merchant, wrote a long and genuinely intelligent rebuttal, arguing that the war would be lost, that the colonies would fall to squabbling among themselves, that a republic of that size had never been made to work and could not be, and that the connection with Britain was the source of the prosperity that the pamphlet took for granted. That is the argument answering the argument, and it is the way a free press works, and it did not save him, because he had to leave the country within the year. In Britain there was no answering pamphlet from the government, because the government did not answer pamphlets. The government prosecuted them. Copies were seized. Printers who reprinted it in London and Edinburgh were threatened with prosecution for seditious libel, and several editions had to be published with the most dangerous passages cut out, which is why some British copies of Common Sense are missing whole pages of the argument about the king. It was burned publicly by the hangman in more than one place, which was the standard ceremony for a condemned book, carried out by the same official who carried out the other sentences. And the identity of the author, which was an open secret in Philadelphia within weeks, became known in London soon enough, and was written down and remembered and filed. A middle-aged former excise officer from Norfolk was now, in the eyes of his own government, one of the most dangerous men alive, and he would remain on that list for the rest of his life. And that is the moment at which most tellings of this story stop, as though a man's life were the same shape as his most famous book. But he was 39 years old on the day it was published, and he had 33 more years to live, and the astonishing thing about those 33 years is that he never once did the sensible thing. He never converted the fame into money or office. He never wrote the safe second book. He went straight from the pamphlet into the war, and then straight from the war into a second revolution in another country, and then into a prison, and then into a fight with the entire religious establishment of the Western world, and he lost. over and over, and he kept going. So let us stay with him. There is no rush. Let your breathing go loose and easy. There is nothing coming in the rest of this story that will jolt you, only a long road with a great deal of weather on it. In the summer of 1776, having written the most influential pamphlet in the language, he could have had almost any comfortable civilian position in the new government of Pennsylvania. What he did instead was enlist. He was 39, in an age when that was not young, with no military training beyond one voyage on a privateer. And he joined a battalion of Pennsylvania volunteers as a private soldier, and then became an aide to a general, a Rhode Island Quaker's son who had been read out of his meeting for military zeal, a man with a stiff knee and a self-taught education very like his own, who became one of the 2 or 3 genuinely great commanders the American side produced. And so he was present that autumn for the worst military catastrophe of the whole war. The British came in August with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent anywhere, 32,000 men and hundreds of ships, and they landed on Long Island and beat the American army badly, and then took New York, and then kept coming. What followed was 3 months of continuous retreat across New Jersey in the rain, an army melting away by desertion and expiry of enlistment, from 20,000 men down to something like 3,000 fit for duty, walking west with the enemy a day behind, burning the bridges. Crossing the Delaware into Pennsylvania in December with the ice already forming, and looking at the plain arithmetic of an army that would legally cease to exist on the 31st of December when the enlistments ran out. Congress fled Philadelphia. The cause was, by any rational measure, finished, and the whole enterprise looked like it would be over inside a month, and the men who had signed the declaration in July began to think seriously about the fact that their signatures were on a document that would shortly be evidence in a treason trial. He walked that retreat with the army. He was not in a coach. He was on foot in the mud with the rest of them, and by his own account he wrote at night, on the head of a drum by the light of the campfires, in the villages they stopped in. And on the 19th of December, in a Philadelphia paper, there appeared an essay signed with the name he now used, the first of a series he called The American Crisis, and it opened with 13 words that are still, 2.5 centuries later, among the most recognizable in the language. These are the times that try men's souls. And then the next sentence, which is the whole of him in one line, about the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot, who in this crisis will shrink from the service of his country. And then, immediately, before the reader can settle into being scolded, the turn that made it work, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph, that what we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly, and that heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods. Read that as a piece of writing done under those conditions, and it is a small miracle of tone. He is addressing an army that has just been beaten for 4 straight months, in the week of its lowest morale, and he does not lie to them, and he does not despair at them, and he does not flatter them. He tells them plainly that this is the bottom, that panic in such times is a natural thing which will pass, that tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, and that a man who stands now will be worth remembering. On Christmas Eve, or the day after by some accounts, the commanding general ordered it read aloud to the assembled regiments on the bank of the Delaware, company by company, in the freezing dark. On the night of the 26th of December, in a sleet storm, that army crossed the river in boats among the ice floes, marched 9 miles in the dark, and fell on the Hessian garrison at Trenton at 8 in the morning, and took the town in 45 minutes, and captured nearly 1,000 men. 8 days later, they beat a British force at Princeton. The war did not end that winter, and the men re-enlisted, and the whole thing went on for another 6.5 years. There is no way to measure what a piece of writing contributed to a night like that, but the men who were there believed it mattered, and they said so afterwards in their letters and their memoirs, and the general who ordered it read never afterwards spoke of that pamphlet series as anything less than a piece of ordnance. He kept writing them. There were 13 numbered crisis papers in the end, spread across the whole 7 years of the war, and then a last one on the day peace was proclaimed, and they are a running commentary on the conflict written from inside it, addressed by turns to the American people, to the British ministry, to the loyalists, to the people of England directly, and once, memorably, to a particular British general by name, taunting him about the difference between occupying cities and conquering a country. They were reprinted everywhere, and read aloud in camp, and smuggled into New York while the British held it, and they did the thing that only writing can do in a long war, which is to keep telling a scattered and exhausted population, month after month, that they are all in the same story, and that the story has a shape. And he took again nothing for them. Not one penny. He gave the copyright away every time, so that any printer anywhere could reprint them free, which is exactly why they spread as they did, and which meant that the most widely read author in the country was, throughout the entire war, effectively unemployed. He held one paid post. In 1777, Congress appointed him secretary to its Committee for Foreign Affairs, which put a penniless English radical at the centre of the young country's confidential correspondence with Europe, reading the dispatches from the commissioners in Paris, keeping the books, drafting the letters. It paid him $70 a month in a currency that was inflating so fast that within 2 years the phrase "not worth a continental" had entered the language as a proverb. And he held it for 2 years, and then he blew it up, in a way that tells you everything about why this man never in his life managed to keep a position. There was a scandal. One of the American commercial agents in Paris, a Connecticut man of considerable charm and flexible ethics, came home under a cloud and published a defense of himself in the newspapers, attacking his critics. It was a nasty and complicated affair involving public money, private trading accounts, and the question of whether supplies which the French court had sent to America as a secret gift had been billed to Congress as a commercial sale, with somebody pocketing the difference, and the secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs sitting on the actual documents, and unable to bear watching the country lied to in print, wrote to the papers himself and refuted the man from the files. Which was true, and which was right, and which was a catastrophe, because in doing it he publicly revealed that France had been secretly supplying America with money and munitions for a full year before the alliance was signed, at a time when France was formally at peace with Britain and was still officially pretending to be neutral. The French minister in Philadelphia went straight to Congress in a fury and demanded a disavowal, and got one. Congress declared the statement unauthorized. He was hauled up, denied the right to defend himself before the chamber, and resigned in January of 1779 before he could be dismissed. So there he is, in the middle of a war he had done as much as any man alive to bring about, 42 years old, publicly disowned by the government he served, out of office, out of money, with no savings, having given away the earnings of the best-selling publication in American history. His enemies in Congress, and there were plenty, mostly the more conservative merchant delegates, who had never liked having a levelling Englishman near the confidential papers, were delighted. And within a few months, with the war going badly, an army unpaid and half-starving, and Philadelphia in a state of near riot over food prices, he did the most quietly extraordinary thing of his whole American career. Working again as a clerk, this time for the Pennsylvania Assembly, at a modest salary, he learned exactly how bad the position was, because he was the man copying the dispatches, and he took $500 of his own salary, which was very close to everything he had, and put it in as the opening subscription to a fund to feed and supply the army, and got the merchants of the city to follow. And that subscription became the Bank of Pennsylvania, which raised something like £300,000 in provisions and credit, and kept the army in the field through a critical season. A man with no property started a bank with his wages. Then, in 1781, he sailed back across the Atlantic on the most important errand of the war, as the unofficial companion and effective secretary to a young colonel sent by Congress to Versailles to ask, bluntly, for a great deal of money. They got it. They came back on a French frigate with 2.5 million livres in silver in the hold, in a convoy of transports loaded with clothing and muskets and powder, and that silver was in the pay chests within weeks, and the war was won at Yorktown that autumn. His name is on none of the treaties. He got no salary for the voyage and no commission, and he came home to find himself so poor that friends had to intervene with Congress to arrange him a small pension, which was voted grudgingly in secret session with an argument, and paid irregularly. The state of New York more generously gave him a confiscated Loyalist farm at New Rochelle, 300 acres or so, with an orchard and a stone house, about 20 miles from the city, and Pennsylvania voted him £500, and Congress eventually $3,000. That is the sum total of what the American Revolution paid the author of Common Sense, a farm, a small pension, and a lump sum granted reluctantly after lobbying at the age of 48. And peace, when it came in 1783, did something to him that the war never had, which was to leave him with nothing to do. This is a pattern with revolutionaries, and it is not a small thing. He had spent 8 years in a state of total mobilization, writing at the highest pitch a man can sustain, on the winning side of the most consequential argument of the century. And then it was over, and the country turned to the ordinary business of tariffs and state debts and boundary commissions, and the men who had been his colleagues turned into a governing class, and he was 50 years old, with no profession, no family, a farm he did not much want to farm, and a reputation as a dangerous man to have at your dinner table. He wrote a few things on public credit and on the charter of the Bank of North America, taking, interestingly, the side of the bank and of hard money against the paper money faction, which lost him friends among the radicals in Pennsylvania, and which shows that he was never a simple partisan of any side. And then he did something nobody expected, which was to stop writing about politics altogether and go back to being an engineer. He had never lost the taste for mechanics he had picked up at those London lectures. And for 4 years, in his 50s, he worked on a single technical problem, which was how to bridge a wide river that freezes. The rivers of the American Northeast were the obstacle to everything. In winter they carry ice down in enormous flows that will take out any pier standing in the channel, and in spring they flood. The bridges of the 18th century were built on piers in the water, of stone or timber, which meant many arches and many obstructions. His idea was to build in iron, cast in segments, and to span the whole river in a single arch of 100 feet or more, with no support in the water at all, on the model, he said, of a spider's web, which is light and strong and hangs from its edges. He built models, one in wood and one in cast iron, and he took them to the American Philosophical Society. And then he decided that the only place in the world where such a thing could actually be manufactured was England, because only England had the ironworks. So in the spring of 1787, at the age of 50, he sailed back across the Atlantic to the country that regarded him as a traitor, carrying a bridge model in his luggage, intending to stay a year or so, see his parents, get the bridge built, and come home. He would not see America again for 15 years, and in the interval he would be sentenced to death by 2 different governments, one of which he had helped to create. He went first to France with a letter of introduction and showed the model to the Academy of Sciences in Paris, and a committee of the most eminent scientists in Europe examined it and reported that it was ingenious and sound. Then he went to England. He went to Thetford and saw his mother, who was over 90, his father having died the year before. He arranged a small allowance for her, which he paid until she died. He went to the ironworks in Yorkshire, where the great founders of the age were pouring the first structural iron in the world, and he had his bridge cast in ribs, and had a 100-foot arch erected on a bowling green in London, and people paid £1 to walk across it, and it stood for a year, and was admired, and was eventually broken up, because his financial backer went bankrupt in a fraud case, and no one else would pay for the abutments. His design was never built as a bridge in his lifetime, but the ironmasters had taken careful note of the arch, and the world's first great iron bridges over the following 20 years, including a very famous one over the Wear at Sunderland, were built on principles he had worked out and published, and there was a dispute about credit which he did not have the money to pursue. And while all this was going on, in the summer of 1789, a crowd in Paris walked into a fortress prison on the eastern edge of the city and took it apart with their hands. He was in England when the news came, and he understood immediately what it meant, and he was one of the very few people in Europe who had already lived through the beginning of one of these. He crossed to Paris repeatedly over the next 2 years. He was by then a genuine celebrity there, because Common Sense had been translated and read in France in the 1780s, and the American War was a French national triumph, and he was received as one of the fathers of it. The young French general who had fought in America, and who now commanded the National Guard of Paris, gave him the great iron key of the demolished fortress to carry as a gift to the American president, and it hangs on the wall of that president's house on the Potomac to this day, and it was carried there by a former excise officer from Norfolk. And then, in November of 1790, the argument of his life arrived in the post, in the form of a book by a man he had known personally and rather liked. The author was an Irish-born member of Parliament, one of the great orators of the century, who had spent his whole career on the liberal side of most questions, who had defended the Americans in the House of Commons through the whole war and been abused for it, who had prosecuted the abuses of the East India Company for years out of genuine moral outrage. He was, on paper, the last man you would expect to write the founding text of modern conservatism. And in Reflections on the Revolution in France, he did exactly that, and it landed like a shell. He argued that a society is not a machine to be redesigned by clever men on a clean sheet, but an inheritance, a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born, and that the accumulated customs and prejudices of a nation contain more practical wisdom than the reasoning of any generation of philosophers. He argued that abstract rights, stated in the air, are worthless, and that what protects an Englishman is not a declaration of the rights of man, but 1,000 years of particular concrete entailed liberties. And he predicted, in the winter of 1790, when the French Revolution was still in its constitutional and hopeful phase, and almost nobody in Europe expected anything worse than a limited monarchy, that it would end in the confiscation of property, the destruction of religion, the collapse of the currency, mob rule, and finally a military dictatorship under some popular general. The book sold 30,000 copies. It was, in a great deal of its prophecy, correct, and it contained one passage that could not be allowed to stand, in which he described the French queen as he had seen her years before, glittering like the morning star, and lamented that the age of chivalry was gone, and that a nation of gallant men would no longer draw their swords for her. The answer came in 4 months. Rights of Man, Part 1, was published in London in March of 1791, and it went at the Reflections with a hammer. The core of it is one idea, and it is the same idea he had been working with since the excise pamphlet 20 years earlier, that no generation has the right to bind the next. He put it as a flat principle. Every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave, he said, is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. A parliament in the year 1688 could no more bind the people of 1791 than a man can bind his grandchildren to a bargain they were never present at. Then he went at the chivalry passage and produced the line that stuck to his opponent for the rest of his life and beyond it, that he pities the plumage but forgets the dying bird, that the man had written a whole book of exquisite sympathy for a queen's feelings and not one page for the millions of people whose actual condition the revolution was about. And then he did what he always did, which was to get concrete, and it is Part 2, published in February of 1792, that terrified the British government far more than Part 1, because Part 1 was a defence of a revolution in another country, and Part 2 was a plan for this one. In Part 2 he stopped arguing about France entirely and set out, in about 10 pages of arithmetic, a costed programme for the British state. He worked from the actual published tax revenues. He proposed the abolition of the poor rates and their replacement with a national allowance paid to every family for every child under 14, to be spent on schooling and clothing, a sum he calculated. He proposed a universal old age pension, at a lower rate from the age of 50 and a higher rate from 60, claimed as a right rather than begged as charity. on the argument that a labouring man has paid far more into the state through the duties on his beer and candles and salt over his working life than he will ever get back. He proposed maternity payments at birth and a grant at marriage, and money to cover funerals for those who die away from home, which was aimed at the itinerant poor who ended in a pauper's grave. He proposed publicly funded education for every child. He proposed employment houses in London for casual workers. And he proposed to pay for it all with a steeply graduated tax on large landed estates, rising to something close to confiscation at the top, on the argument that the great estates were the product of a conquest and a system of primogeniture that concentrated land unnaturally in 1792. That is a welfare state, described in detail, with the money identified 150 years before Britain built one, and written by a man who had been a tax collector and knew exactly where the revenue actually came from. And it sold. This is the thing that changed everything. Part 1 sold perhaps 50,000 copies at 3 shillings, which was already a great deal. And then he had Part 2 and cheap editions of both together, printed at 6pence, which is the price of a loaf of bread deliberately at a loss, so that a working man could buy it out of a week's wages. The corresponding societies, which were the new political clubs of shoemakers and weavers and printers springing up in Sheffield and Norwich and Manchester and London, bought them in bulk and read them aloud at meetings. Estimates of the total circulation in Britain in the first 2 years run from 100,000 to 200,000 copies, and the higher figures are probably closer. And again the reading was collective. In a country of some 10 million people with no vote for the overwhelming majority, this was a political education happening outside every institution designed to control one, and the government understood exactly what it was looking at. The reaction was one of the most thorough campaigns of repression in modern British history. In May of 1792, a royal proclamation was issued against wicked and seditious writings, which was aimed at one book, and everybody knew which. Prosecutions began against booksellers and printers, and over the following years dozens of men went to prison for selling or lending a copy, some of them for years, and a shopkeeper in Scotland got 14 years' transportation to Australia for less. Loyalist associations were founded and funded, and organised what were called church and king mobs. And through the winter of that year effigies of the author were burned in market squares in hundreds of English towns, sometimes with a copy of the book pinned to the chest, in a kind of nationwide ritual. Songs were written about hanging him. Cartoons appeared showing him as a devilish little corset maker measuring the globe for a pair of stays. His writings were formally prosecuted for seditious libel, and the trial was set for December. And 2 things happened before that trial. The first is that his own country made him, formally, a criminal. The second is that another country made him a legislator. In the summer of 1792, the new French Assembly conferred honorary French citizenship on a short list of foreign friends of liberty. And then 4 separate French departments elected him to the National Convention that was to write a republican constitution for France. He did not speak French. Not conversationally, not at all, in any useful way, and he never really learned it, and he accepted, and in September, warned by friends that a warrant for his arrest was about to be served, and that he had days at most, he left London for the coast. The story that has come down, and it may be embroidered, is that the poet and engraver who was his friend told him to go that hour, and not to sleep another night in the city. At Dover the customs officers went through his baggage with a thoroughness that was clearly not about smuggling, opening and reading his private letters at the quayside, hunting for anything that would allow them to hold him. They found nothing that would serve, and the packet sailed, and about 20 minutes later, by the accounts, an order arrived to detain him. He never set foot in England again. In December, in the Court of King's Bench, he was tried in his absence for seditious libel. His defence counsel was the finest advocate in England, a man who took the brief knowing it would cost him his position in the household of the Prince of Wales, which it did. Immediately the prosecution had packed the special jury, and the verdict came without the jury even retiring to consider. He was convicted and declared an outlaw, which in English law meant that he was outside the protection of the law altogether, He could not sue, could not inherit, could not own property in England, and could be seized on sight, and had he ever returned he would have been hanged. So at 55 years old he was, simultaneously, an outlaw of the British Crown with a death sentence over him, and an elected representative of the French people, sitting in a chamber where he could not follow the debate. He crossed to Calais to a hero's reception, with the town turned out and the guard drawn up, and a salute fired from the battery, and he took his seat in Paris, in a city that was already, though he did not fully see it yet, sliding out from under everybody's feet. 3 weeks before he arrived, the prisons of Paris had been broken open by crowds, and over 1,000 prisoners had been killed in the streets over 4 days. The monarchy had been abolished. France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and about to be at war with Britain. And the convention he now sat in was splitting into 2 factions who would shortly be killing each other. He attached himself, naturally and immediately, to the more moderate Republican group, the men of the provinces and the commercial cities, who admired him and translated for him and put him on the committee to draft the new constitution, where he did serious work that shows up in the text. And then, within weeks, came the question that decided his fate, which was what to do with the king. He was in an extraordinary position on that question, and it is the clearest single window into the man. Nobody in that chamber had done more than he had, over 17 years, to destroy the idea of monarchy in the Western mind. He had written the sentences about the crowned ruffian. He had argued that hereditary rule was a fraud on the human race. And when the convention voted, in January of 1793, on the fate of a particular man, he stood up and had his speech read out for him in French translation, and he argued against killing him. His reasons were exactly what you would expect if you had been paying attention. He said that the king as an institution was already dead, and that killing the person added nothing to the argument. He said that France should not do to a defeated enemy what it condemned in monarchy itself, which is to answer a grievance with a body. He said that the man had, whatever else was true, sent the fleet and the army that had made American independence possible, and that Americans would find it very hard to watch, and he proposed instead perpetual banishment to the United States, where the ex-king could live out his life as a private citizen, and where, he suggested, the sight of a free country might do him some good. The chamber did not like it, and there were shouts that he was a Quaker whose religion made him squeamish, and the sentence of death passed by a very narrow margin, and the king went to the scaffold on the 21st of January. And by taking that position, in public, on the record, he had marked himself. Within 6 months his faction had been purged, arrested and largely executed, and the machinery that men now call the terror was running, and the criteria for the guillotine had loosened until they could accommodate almost anybody. He was a foreigner, he was English, and France was at war with England. He was an American, and relations with America were strained. He had voted to spare the king. He had been the friend and dinner companion of a dozen men whose heads were already off. He spent most of 1793 in a house with a walled garden in the Faubourg Saint-Denis, going nowhere, drinking rather more brandy than was good for him, which he admitted, and writing and waiting. In late December the convention voted to exclude and arrest all foreigners. They came for him at 3 or 4 in the morning on the 28th of December, 1793. A party of officers with a warrant, and the story that goes with that night is a good one and appears to be true in outline. He had spent the previous months writing a book, and he had it in a state fit to be read, and knowing what was coming he had arranged that on the way to the prison the escort would call at the lodgings of an American friend, a Connecticut poet living in Paris, and he handed the manuscript over at the door. Then he went to the Luxembourg. The Luxembourg had been a royal palace, and was now a prison holding several hundred people, and it was, by the standards of that winter, one of the better ones. Prisoners could walk in the corridors and talk to each other, and receive food from outside if they had money, and he had a room to himself for a while, and he was ill much of the time with an abscess in his side, and a fever that at one point took him close to death. What the Luxembourg was, above everything else, was a waiting room. Every few days a clerk came with a list, and the names on the list were taken away in the morning in an open cart through the streets to the Place de l'Evolution, and the people left behind heard the carts go. He was there for 10 months, and in those 10 months, something like 168 of his fellow prisoners in that one building were taken out and killed, including men he ate with. And in the middle of it came the night that has become the single most famous story about him, and which he told himself afterwards in print. The practice, when a batch of prisoners was to be taken in the morning, was for the guards to go along the corridor in the evening and chalk a mark on the door of each cell whose occupant was on the list. He was sharing a room by then with 3 Belgians, and their door had been standing open against the wall of the corridor, because the room was hot and he was feverish, and a doctor had ordered it opened for air. The turnkey came along with his chalk and marked the door on the face that was showing, which was the inside face, and went on. Later that evening the door was closed for the night, and the mark went with it, turned in against the wall of the room where no one in the corridor could see it. The next morning the guards came down the corridor reading the doors, and their door was blank, and they passed it. The 3 Belgians and the Englishman lay in that room and listened to the carts. All 3 of his roommates were, by his account, on the list. He never claimed to have arranged it. He said only that the door was open because of the fever, and that the mark went to the wrong side of it, and that 4 men lived because of the position of a piece of furniture. The man who ran the committee that was signing those lists fell from power on the 28th of July, 1794, and was himself dead within a day, and the killing slowed and then stopped. But the release did not come. This is the bitterest passage of the whole life, and there is no way to tell it that makes it less so. He was an American citizen by adoption, one of the founders of the United States, and he was in a French prison, and the American minister in Paris at that period took the position that he was a French citizen, having accepted French citizenship and a seat in the convention, and therefore not a matter for the American government. That minister was a New York merchant of strongly conservative and aristocratic sympathies who had disliked him for years and made no serious effort. And behind that, silence from Philadelphia. The President of the United States, the man he had marched with in the retreat across New Jersey, the man who had ordered the crisis read to his troops, the man who kept the key of the Bastille on his wall, did not act, and did not write, and there is no surviving evidence that he made any private representation on behalf of the prisoner either. There were reasons. The administration was negotiating a delicate treaty with Britain that year, and was desperate not to be seen embracing a man the British had outlawed for sedition. And the American government had every interest in keeping its distance from the French Revolution altogether. Those are real reasons of state. They are also exactly the kind of reasoning that a man dying of fever in a Paris prison, who had given his whole working life and every penny he had earned to that country, was never going to accept, and he did not accept it. Ever. In August of 1794, a new American minister arrived, a Virginian, and he took a different view entirely, and moved at once, and formally reclaimed the prisoner as an American citizen, and got him out in November after 10 months inside. Then he took him into his own house, where the man lay ill for a year and a half, an old wound in his side, and the fever and the effects of the brandy and the imprisonment altogether, expected to die more than once, and nursed by the minister's wife. And while he lay there he did 2 things. He finished the book that had been in the poet's hands, and he wrote a letter to the President of the United States, and then he published it. That letter is not a pleasant document. It is long, and it is cold, and it goes carefully through the history of the war and the author's part in it, and it accuses the President of ingratitude and of a treacherous indifference to the fate of a friend, and it ends by telling him that the world will be puzzled to decide whether he is an apostate or an impostor, whether he has abandoned good principles or whether he ever had any. It was, politically, a catastrophic act of self-destruction. Washington was, by then, not merely a president but very nearly a sacred figure to the American public, and attacking him in that register was a thing no reputation could survive. It was seized on gleefully by the opposition press in America, and quoted for decades against its author. and it destroyed him at home more thoroughly than anything his English enemies ever managed. And the book did the rest. The Age of Reason came out in 2 parts, the first written in the weeks before the arrest, and the second during the long convalescence afterwards, and it is the reason that a man who had been a hero in America in 1776 was, 20 years later, a name that respectable families used as a warning. It is important to be accurate about what is actually in it, because for 2 centuries it has mostly been described by people who had not read it. It is not an atheist book. He says so on the first page, and he says it plainly, that he believes in one God and no more, and that he hopes for happiness beyond this life. What he was, and what a great many educated men of that century privately were, including several American presidents, was a deist. Someone who believed that the order of the universe is itself the evidence of a creator, that the proper study of that creator is the study of the natural world he made, and that the moral duties of a human being are to do justice, love mercy, and try to make our fellow creatures happy. He wrote it, he said, because he was afraid of the opposite danger. He had watched the French revolutionaries in their fury against a church that had been an arm of the state and a great landlord and a machine of privilege begin to throw out the idea of God altogether, and he thought that was a disaster. And he wanted to make the case for a religion of reason before the whole thing collapsed into nothing. That was his motive, and it is stated openly, and almost nobody at the time cared, because of the second half of the book. Because having said that, he then went through the Bible, book by book, as a hostile textual critic, in language of extraordinary bluntness, in a cheap edition. For the general reader. He questioned the authorship of the books of Moses on internal evidence. He pointed out chronological impossibilities, contradictions between parallel accounts, and passages describing events long after the supposed author's death. He catalogued at length and with disgust the massacres commanded and celebrated in the historical books, and asked how a book which records the slaughter of whole populations including children could be described as the word of a merciful God. He treated the prophecies as retrospective and the miracles as improbable, and he applied to the New Testament the same instruments. And he did all of it in the plain, brisk, contemptuous style that had worked so beautifully on the Crown of England, and applied to the Crown of England it had made him a hero, and applied to Scripture it made him, in the eyes of a very religious country, a monster. It sold enormously, as everything he wrote sold. It was read, in cheap pirated editions, exactly where he intended it to be read, in the workshops and taverns of Britain and America, and in Britain the publisher who sold it went to prison, and the counterattack was of a completely different order to anything he had faced before. Because the church did not merely disagree with him, it went after the man. Dozens of refutations were published within a few years, and the standard technique in most of them was to establish that a person who wrote such things must be personally depraved. And so the biography was assembled, that he was a drunkard, that he was filthy in his habits, that he had abandoned 2 wives, that he beat his creditors, that he had recanted in terror on his deathbed and begged for a minister. The deathbed story in particular was manufactured, promoted for a century, printed in tracts, and taught to children, and it was false. And the people at the actual deathbed said so at the time, and were not listened to. The drinking was real by then, and increasing. The rest was largely constructed. And it worked so completely that for 150 years the man's name was, in ordinary respectable American and British usage, essentially a synonym for infidelity, and his political writings were dragged down with it. And generations grew up hearing that the author of Common Sense was a dirty atheist, which is 2 false statements in 5 words. He stayed in France until 1802, 7 years after the prison, and they were quiet years, and mostly sad ones. He wrote one more thing in that period which deserves far more attention than it gets, a short pamphlet called Agrarian Justice, written in 1796 in answer to a bishop's sermon on the wisdom and goodness of God in having made both rich and poor. His answer to that was that God made neither, that God made the earth and made it the common property of the human race, and that private property in land is a human invention which has produced enormous benefits in cultivation and enormous injury in dispossession. But, he said, and this is the move that makes it interesting, he did not propose to undo it. He accepted that cultivated land must be held privately because the improvements belonged to the improver. What he proposed was compensation. Every proprietor of cultivated land, he argued, owes the community a ground rent for the land itself, as distinct from the improvements, and out of a national fund built from that rent, every single person on reaching the age of 21 should be paid a lump sum, and every person on reaching 50 should receive an annual pension for life. Not charity. Not a relief for the destitute. A payment made to everybody, rich and poor alike, as a matter of right, in compensation for the natural inheritance which the system of landed property had taken from them at birth. He costed it. That pamphlet is the earliest full statement in the Western tradition of an unconditional basic capital grant and a universal pension funded by a tax on land values. And people are still arguing about the idea now, in almost exactly the terms he set out. It sold badly. Meanwhile, France was becoming something he did not recognize. The republic he had come to help build was consumed first by the Directory, and then by a young Corsican general who came back from Egypt, took the government in a coup, made himself first consul, then consul for life, and finally, in 1804, took a crown out of the Pope's hands in Notre Dame and put it on his own head. There is a story, told by the old man himself and by others, that in the early days the general sought him out and flattered him lavishly, told him that a statue of gold ought to be erected to him in every city in the universe, and said that he slept with a copy of Rights of Man under his pillow. And the old man, watching him over the following years, said that he was the completest charlatan that ever existed. And there it was. He had spent his life arguing that hereditary power was an absurdity, and he lived long enough to watch a revolution made in the name of the Rights of Man crown an emperor, and to know that the Irishman with the great book, whom he had answered with a hammer, had predicted precisely that outcome in print in 1790, and had been laughed at for it. He never conceded the point in public. But he stopped writing about France. In 1802, at the age of 65, he finally went home, or to the place he considered home, at the invitation of the new American president, the Virginian who had drafted the Declaration, and who was one of the few men in public life still willing to be seen writing him a friendly letter, and who offered him a passage on a national ship, which was a considerable gesture, and which was leaked and made a scandal. He crossed in the autumn and landed in Baltimore, and what he came home to was not the country he had left. 15 years had passed. The generation that had read Common Sense aloud in the taverns had children now who had grown up in a settled republic and had been taught in a great religious revival that was rolling through the country, and the newspapers of the party opposed to the president were looking for a stick to beat him with, and here was one delivered by government transport. The abuse that met him in the press was of a viciousness that startled even the people who had arranged it. He was called a lying, drunken, brutal infidel. Federalist papers ran editorials suggesting that God might strike the ship. He toured a little in the first months, gave a few dinners, wrote a series of open letters to the citizens of the United States restating the case for the Republic, and found that a considerable part of the country would not have him in the house. Old friends crossed the street. A stagecoach refused to carry him. He was, at 65, the most famous living writer in the English language and could not always get a room. He settled eventually on the farm at New Rochelle that New York had given him 20 years before, and for a few years he lived there and in lodgings in the city, in decreasing circumstances, cared for by a French family he had brought over with him, doing small engineering work, writing letters to the papers on the boundary questions and the Louisiana Purchase, which he supported and which he had actually proposed in a letter to the president years earlier. And the last public humiliation came in 1806, in the election of that year, when he went to vote at New Rochelle, in the town where he owned property, and the Inspector of Elections refused his vote on the ground that he was not a citizen of the United States. The reason given was that the American minister in Paris had once declined to reclaim him as an American, which the inspector took as proof that he was not one. The author of Common Sense was told at the ballot box, in the country he had named, that he was a foreigner. He sued. The case ran on and he never got it decided in his lifetime. Now before we go on to the last years, let us stop for a little while and look at the shape of the whole thing, because we are far enough along the road now to see it, and because there is no hurry, and because this is exactly the sort of quiet stock-taking that is easy to listen to in the dark. Let yourself sink a little further into the mattress while I lay it out. There is nothing here you need to hold on to. Look at the sequence. At 35, he took on the Board of Excise and the British Parliament over the wages of a few thousand of the least glamorous public servants in the kingdom, and lost his job for it. At 38, he took on the crown of Great Britain itself, and was, in the eyes of his own government, guilty of a capital offence from the day the pamphlet appeared. At 54, he took on the entire British political establishment in its own capital, in its own language, at sixpence a copy, and was outlawed and would have hanged if they had caught him. At 56, sitting in a foreign legislature in a language he did not speak, he took on the most powerful faction in revolutionary France over the life of a king he had spent his career denouncing, and it very nearly cost him his head. And at 57, in a prison cell, ill, with the carts going past in the mornings, he began a book attacking the authority of the scriptures and of every organised church in the Western world, which cost him not his life, but something he seems to have valued less than most men do, which was the good opinion of everybody. 4 powers, and then a 5th, one after another, each of them larger than the last, each fight entered voluntarily, none of them profitable, none of them undertaken when there was a safer version of the same argument available. That is not a career. Nobody could plan that. It is a disposition, and it appears to have been fixed in him very early, somewhere between a Quaker father who would not take his hat off to his betters, and a hill outside a market town where the state hanged labourers twice a year for the value of a coat. What made him effective was a combination that almost never occurs in one person. The first half of it is the prose. He is one of the 2 or 3 greatest writers of plain English who ever lived, and the reason is that he had no education to unlearn. He had no Latin, no university, no models. Every other political writer of that century had spent years absorbing a style built out of Cicero and Tacitus, full of balanced clauses and classical allusion, addressed to gentlemen by a gentleman. He wrote the way a good workman explains a job. His sentences are short, his verbs do the work. His images come out of ordinary life and out of the trades, and they are almost always physical. A plank, a fire, a debt, a lock, a spider's web, a suit of clothes outgrown, a moon governing a sun. He never asks the reader to admire the writing, and the effect of that is a kind of trust, because a man who is not performing is more easily believed. And the second half of it is the arithmetic. This is the part that people who admire him as a firebrand consistently miss. He was a tax officer for 12 years. He had spent those years measuring the actual contents of actual barrels and calculating what was owed on them, and the habit never left him. So when he argues for independence, he does not stop at the injustice. He costs a navy. When he attacks the British Constitution, he does not stop at the theory. He goes into the published revenue accounts and shows where the money goes. When he proposes pensions for the old, he prints the table. This many people at this age, at this many pounds a year, comes to this total. And here is the revenue stream that pays for it, and here is what is left over. He is the first great radical writer in English who does the sums in public, and it is why his opponents found him so difficult. Because indignation can be dismissed as temperament, and a table of figures has to be answered. And what defeated him, over and over, was not the arguments of his enemies. It was 3 things in himself. The first is that he could not stop at the point where a sensible man stops. Every one of his catastrophes came from going one step past the necessary. It was not necessary to reveal the secret French supplies in order to refute a dishonest agent. But he had the documents, and the man was lying. So he printed it, and it ended his career in government. It was not necessary to publish the letter to the American president. A private letter would have relieved his feelings and cost him nothing, and he printed it, and it ruined him in America for a century. It was not necessary, having made the case for a religion of reason, to spend 200 pages taking the book of Genesis apart in front of a general readership, and he did it anyway. Because he thought the truth was owed to ordinary people in exactly the same plain language as everything else, and it made him a bogeyman. The second is that he was completely incapable of managing money, or perhaps more precisely he was uninterested in it to a degree that verges on the pathological. He gave away the profits of the best-selling pamphlet in American history. He gave away the copyright of the crisis papers so that any printer could reprint them free. He priced the rights of man below the cost of production on purpose so that a working man could afford it. He put $500, which was nearly everything he had, into a subscription to feed an army. He paid an allowance to his mother in Thetford for years out of an income he did not have, and he then spent the last decades of his life poor, and having to ask, which he hated, and which made him prickly and demanding with the people who did help him, and there is a real sadness in that pattern, because a man who will not take payment for his work ends up dependent on gifts, and gifts come with a tone attached. The third is that he had no gift whatever for the ordinary maintenance of friendship. He was, by all accounts, superb company in a small room, funny, endlessly informative, a great asker of questions about how things were made, generous with his time and with money he did not have, and he was also vain about his work, easily wounded, incapable of letting an insult stand, and inclined to convert a disagreement into a permanent breach in a single afternoon. He quarrelled with his printers, with his colleagues in Congress, with the American minister in Paris, with the president, and finally with a good part of the American public. He never learned the thing that every successful public man learns early, which is that you can be right and still say nothing today. As for his private life, the truth is that we know remarkably little, and that is his own doing. He was married twice. His first wife died with their child within a year of the wedding when he was 23. His second marriage ended in a formal separation after 3 years and appears never to have been a marriage in any full sense at all. And he paid the settlement and walked away and would not discuss it, and when his enemies later taunted him about it in print, which they did repeatedly and crudely, he refused every single time to explain himself, saying only that it concerned nobody but the two people involved, and that the lady's reputation was not going to be defended by his making a public statement about her. It cost him a great deal to keep that silence, and he kept it for 35 years. He had no children. He had a series of intense half-paternal friendships with younger men and with the families who took him in, and in his last decade the household he lived in was somebody else's, which is a lonely arrangement for an old man however kindly it is meant. He drank more than was good for him from about the time of the prison onwards, and his enemies made him into a stumbling sot, which the reliable witnesses deny. But the brandy was real and it was doing him harm, and it was quite obviously a way of managing the pain in his side, and the memory of the corridor, and the 10 months of listening for a name. And there is one more thing to say before we go on, and it is the strangest fact in this whole life. He was not, in any conventional sense, a man with a country. He was born English and was condemned to death by England. He was made a citizen of France and imprisoned by France. He was one of the founders of the United States, and was refused a vote at his own polling place in the state that had given him his farm, on the ground that he was not an American. He signed himself once a citizen of the world, and he meant it as a plain description rather than a boast, because he genuinely did not believe that the accident of where a person was born created any moral claim that outranked the claims of humanity in general. He thought a wrong done in Paris was the same size as a wrong done in Philadelphia. He thought a hungry child in Norfolk was exactly as much your business as a hungry child in your own street. In the 1790s, this was regarded as an eccentricity bordering on treason in every country he lived in. It is the ordinary language of every international declaration written since, and again, hardly anyone remembers who was standing on that ground first, in a plain coat, with no money, being burned in effigy in 300 English market squares. So keep all that in your mind, loosely, the way you would hold a warm cup, as we come to the last part of the story. A man of 65, coming home to a country that had changed under him, carrying 5 great public fights. 1 prison, 2 death sentences, no money, no family, a name that was being used to frighten children, and an absolutely unbroken conviction that he had been right every time. He had in fact been right nearly every time. That is the part that history took 2 centuries to concede. And it did not help him at all in the summer of 1803, when he needed a room and a fire and somebody to talk to in the evenings, because the America he had come back to was in the middle of a religious awakening of enormous power, the second great one, and it was rolling west and south through the camp meetings and the circuit riders and the new congregations of the frontier, and it had made the question of a man's faith the first thing anybody wanted to know about him. That awakening was not a small or a foolish thing. It carried real comfort into hard lives, and a great many of the reforms he would have approved of, including the abolition movement, came directly out of it. But it meant that a book which took the scriptures apart chapter by chapter, in cheap print, for the general reader, was not going to be treated in the United States of 1803 as an interesting contribution to a debate. It was going to be treated as an attack on the one thing holding a raw new country together. And on top of that, there was the party press, which in that decade was the most savage in American history, before or since. The Republic had split into 2 ferocious factions, and the newspapers of each were subsidized, semi-official, and entirely uninhibited, and they printed things about sitting presidents that no modern editor would put in the paper. The opposition needed a stick with which to beat the president who had invited the old man home on a government vessel, and the stick was delivered to them, elderly and infirm, at the dock in Baltimore. So the campaign that met him was not really about him at all. He was a proxy. Every attack on the infidel was an attack on the administration that had welcomed him, and the more scandalous the accusation, the better it served, and there was no cost to inventing one, because he had no money to sue with and no allies willing to be seen defending an infidel in print. The particular charges are worth listing once plainly, because they became the standard biography, and they are still repeated. That he was a habitual drunkard who was rarely sober, that he was physically filthy and offensive to be near, that he had deserted a wife and beaten her, that he had cheated his creditors, that he was a coward who had run from every danger, that he had gone mad, and, above all, that he had recanted at the end in terror. Against each of those, the testimony of the people who actually shared a house with him in his last years, including a doctor, a Quaker cabinet maker, and the woman who nursed him, is direct and consistent, and was published, and was ignored, because by then the story was more useful than the evidence. The single most damaging piece of the whole apparatus arrived within months of his death, when a New York editor who had once been a supporter, and had swung violently the other way, rushed out a biography full of invented scenes and unsourced anecdotes, and it went into edition after edition, and became for 2 generations the standard life, quoted in every subsequent account, taught as fact. He was sued for libel over parts of it by the very woman who had nursed the old man, and he lost, and the jury found against him, and it made no difference at all to the book's circulation. That is how a reputation is actually destroyed. Not by argument, by repetition, cheaply printed, in the absence of anyone with an interest in correcting it. And underneath all of that noise, the actual life he was living in those years at New Rochelle was very quiet indeed. The farm was a working one, but he was not much of a farmer and let it out. He had a stone house with an orchard on a slope with a view over the Sound. He kept up his correspondence, which was enormous, and he still could not resist a public question. He wrote about the Louisiana Purchase and about the defense of New York Harbor, proposing gunboats. He wrote a piece on the causes of yellow fever, which was killing thousands in the American ports every summer. And he was wrong about the cause, as everyone was for another century. But he was right that it was somehow bound up with the state of the docks and the standing water. He tinkered with his old bridge model. He worked at a design for a smokeless candle and at a way of using gunpowder as a motive force, which is an odd little footnote in the prehistory of the engine. He read the papers, and he was, by every account, still magnificent to sit with in the evening if you were young and curious and did not mind an old man who talked for 2 hours without stopping. The people who came out to see him in those years were mostly young, mostly radicals, mostly printers and freethinkers, and a few men who had been boys in the war and remembered the crisis being read out. And there was one other kind of visitor, and it is worth mentioning, because it is one of the few consolations in this last stretch. Black Americans came to see him, individually, sometimes having walked out from the city, because of the piece he had written in his very first month as a working journalist in America, 30 years earlier, when he was nobody, in which he had said in plain terms that the trade in human beings was a wickedness, that the enslaved had been stolen out of their own countries by force, and that a people who were at that moment writing petitions to the king about their own liberty had no business holding several 100,000 people in bondage while they did it. He had written that in 1775, when it was very far from a safe or fashionable thing to publish in a city whose merchants were involved in the trade. He had helped with the preamble to the Pennsylvania Act of 1780 that began the gradual ending of slavery in that state, which was the first such law in the Western world. He had proposed in a plan for the Western lands that the money from their sale might be used to help settle freed people on farms of their own. None of that had made him popular. All of it was remembered by the people it concerned, and it is why when almost nobody else came, 2 of them came to the graveside. His health went in stages. The fall down the stairs in 1806 took away a great deal. He could still write letters, but the hand shakes visibly in the last ones. He gave up the farm gradually, selling parcels to live. He moved to lodgings in the city, and then to other lodgings, and then, when the stairs beat him, to the small wooden house in the village to the north, where the family from Paris could look after him properly. He was in constant pain from the old abscess, and he took laudanum for it, and brandy on top of the laudanum, which is a poor combination in a man of 71. He knew what was happening. He made his will in January of 1809, and it is a decent, careful, unbitter document, the farm to be sold, and the money to go to the French woman and her sons, whom he treated as his own family, some small legacies to old friends from the war, a request about his burial, and one line stating clearly that he died in perfect composure and resignation to the will of his Creator, God, which he put in specifically so that nobody could later claim otherwise. They claimed otherwise anyway. And so we come, quietly, to the end of it. Let your breathing settle again if it has picked up anywhere along the way. There is nothing frightening in what is left, only an old man in a small room in a village that is now a few streets of a very large city, being looked after tolerably well by people who were fond of him, while the world outside got on with the business he had helped to start, and did not much want to be reminded where it had come from. He did not know, and could not have known, that within 60 years the country he had named would fight itself nearly to pieces over the institution he had condemned in his first American article, and would be held together by a man whose plain style was descended directly from his own. He did not know that the programme in the back half of Rights of Man would be law across the industrial world within a century and a half. He did not know that his own market town would put up a golden statue of him. He knew only that it was June, that the light came in the window in the mornings, that his side hurt, and that people kept coming to the door to ask him to take it all back. The last 3 years are quiet and small, and not very kind. He had a stroke, or something very like one, in the summer of 1806, falling down a flight of stairs at his lodgings, and after that he did not really recover his strength or his handwriting. He sold off pieces of the farm to live on. He moved into cheaper and cheaper rooms in New York, and then, when he could no longer manage stairs, into a small house on Herring Street, in what was then the village of Greenwich, north of the city, where the woman of the French family he had brought from Paris nursed him, along with a doctor, a Quaker cabinet maker who came out of simple kindness, and a couple of old friends from the war years who had not deserted him. He was bedridden at the end, and in a good deal of pain from the abscess he had carried since the Luxembourg. And in those last weeks there was a steady traffic of visitors at the door who had not come to see him but to work on him, ministers of several denominations who came, some politely and some not. To press him to recant, to say before witnesses that he repudiated the age of reason and accepted the divinity of Christ, because a deathbed recantation from that man would have been the most valuable single piece of evidence in the entire religious controversy of the age. 2 women came into his room and told him they had a message from Almighty God. He told them, according to the account, that God would not send a message by such foolish and ugly messengers, and to get out. He did not recant. He asked once to be buried in the Quaker burial ground out of respect for his father, and the meeting refused him, and he took the refusal calmly and arranged to be buried on his own farm instead. He died on the morning of the 8th of June, 1809, at 72 years old, in a rented room with almost nothing to leave, and what he did leave he left to the French family who had cared for him and to a couple of old friends. The body was carried out to New Rochelle in a wagon, 20-odd miles up the post road, and buried under a walnut tree in the corner of the field. And the funeral of the man whose writing had been read aloud to more people than any other author then alive, who had named the United States of America and written the sentence about the times that try men's souls and given away every penny he ever earned by his pen, was attended by 6 people. His French housekeeper and her small son. A Quaker. A doctor or 2 and 2 black men, freedmen, who had walked out from the city on their own account because of what he had written about slavery 34 years earlier, and who stood at the graveside when almost no one else in the Republic would. The woman set her boy at one end of the grave and stood at the other and said that America had lost her most able and loyal friend. Then everyone went home, and even then it was not quite finished, because 10 years later an English radical journalist named William Cobbett, who had spent the 1790s writing filthy abuse about the man, and had since changed his mind entirely and become his devoted admirer, decided that the bones ought to be brought back to England and given a magnificent public monument by the people who had burned him in. Effigy. So one night in 1819, he and a companion dug up the grave in the corner of that field, put the remains into a box, and shipped them to Liverpool, where the customs officers did not know what to do about it, and the newspapers made a national joke of it, and the crowds that were supposed to subscribe for a monument did not subscribe. The monument was never built. The box stayed in Cobbett's possession for the rest of his life, and when he died in 1835 it was listed among his effects, and then it passed through an auction and a receiver and was broken up, and the pieces were scattered among collectors and relic hunters. There have been claims and rumours ever since about a skull in one place and a hand in another and a rib in a box in Australia, most of them impossible to verify. The plain fact is that the bones of Thomas Paine were lost, and nobody knows where he is. Now let us finish gently, because this is a story that looks, if you stop it at the graveside, like the record of a man who lost everything, and that is not actually what happened. It is only what it looked like in 1809. Consider what was actually left behind. The pamphlet from that snowy January is still, by any measure anyone has been able to construct, the best-selling publication in American history relative to the population that existed to read it, and the declaration that followed 6 months later took its shape from the argument that Pamphlet had made speakable. The name he suggested for the new country stuck. The crisis papers went into the language and stayed there. Rights of Man became the founding text of British working-class politics, and for the next 50 years the men who built the trade unions and the reform societies and the great movement for the vote called themselves his readers openly, and were prosecuted for it, and kept doing it. The programme in the second part of that book, the child allowances and the old age pensions claimed as a right, and the public schooling and the graduated tax on great estates, all of it dismissed as the raving of an atheist corset maker in 1792, was legislated almost item by item in Britain between 1900 and 1948, and something very like it in every advanced country in the world. And hardly anyone who benefits from it has any idea where the list came from. The idea in agrarian justice is argued about in economics departments and parliaments right now. He argued against slavery in print in his first month, as a working journalist in America, and helped draft the preamble to Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act, the first such law passed by any government in the Western world. He argued for the rights of women in 1775. He argued against dueling, against cruelty to animals, against capital punishment, and he tried to save the life of a king he despised because he thought a republic should not begin with a killing. Every single one of those positions was a minority position when he took it, and is the settled opinion of most of the world now. And the reputation that carefully built ruin came back too, slowly, over a very long time. In 1859, a lawyer in Illinois, who had read The Age of Reason as a young man and had once written something similar himself, and been talked into burning it by his friends for the sake of his career, went on to become president and to write, in his own plain, unornamented style, the most famous American sentences after the Declaration. And the debt in that prose is audible to anyone who has read both. A century after the funeral, the town of Thetford in Norfolk, which had produced him and then spent 100 years pretending not to have, put up a gilded statue of him in the marketplace, holding a quill and a copy of the Rights of Man, and it stands there now in the rain, a few hundred yards from where the workshop was, and in sight of the hill where the assizes used to hang people. American presidents of both parties quote the line about beginning the world over again, usually without attribution, and it turns up in inaugural addresses and in speeches at moments of national trouble. And it is one of the very few phrases from the 1770s that still does what it was built to do. And the country that is about to mark 250 years since that summer owes a very large part of the fact that it exists at all to a bankrupt, twice sacked, twice married, twice widowed of Hope English tax collector, who arrived on a stretcher, could not hold a job, offended everybody, took no money, and never once in his life declined a fight with something bigger than himself. So that is where we will leave him. Not at the graveside under the walnut tree, and not in the prison corridor listening to the carts, and not in the London lobby with a pamphlet nobody would read. Let us leave him where we found him, at the beginning, on the 10th of January in the year 1776, in the dark before the winter light comes up, in a narrow street with the snow walked into grey ridges down the middle of it. The press is still working, that slow wooden knock and sigh, patient as a heart, a man leaning his weight onto the bar and letting it come back. The warm sheets are going up on the lines above their heads to dry, row upon row of them, pale in the lamplight, 47 pages at a time. Nobody in that room knows what they are handling. The pressmen are thinking about their breakfast and their cold fingers. The bookseller is thinking about whether 2 shillings is the right price. Out in the city, in a rented room in his one coat, the author is asleep, and he is 38, and he has failed at absolutely everything. And he does not yet know that the thing on that press is going to travel to every corner of the English-speaking world within the year, or that it will cost him his country, his safety, his reputation, and every penny he will ever earn, or that he would do it again, immediately, without hesitating, if you gave him the choice 100 times. He is only asleep, and that is a good place for us to stop as well. Let the press go on knocking, quietly, somewhere in the distance. Let the sheets hang and dry. Let the snow keep falling on the roofs of that old city, filling the ruts in the road, softening every edge of everything, and let the lamplight in that one window stay warm and low and steady all the way through until morning. There is nothing for you to do, there is nothing for you to decide, and nothing left to carry, and nowhere at all you need to be. Your shoulders are down, your jaw is loose. Your breathing has been looking after itself this whole time, exactly as it always does, easy and slow and unhurried, and it will go on looking after you while you sleep. If you are still awake, that is perfectly all right, and you can simply lie here in the warm and let the words go by like weather. If you are already going, then go. The story keeps. It has kept for 250 years, and it will keep until morning. Sleep well, rest easy. And whatever the day was, let it be finished now.